Sarah, sorry, again, going live always has its pratfalls. It's July 21st, 2023, and this is Sergeant Sarah Ashton Cirillo coming to you from the Territorial Defense Forces Media studios. We are live as you are watching Ukraine in the Know, the Armed Forces of Ukraine's only official English language news program. It's Friday afternoon, and I have been broadcasting for pretty much 24 hours straight now. And this show is going to be a little bit different. Why? Because I'm hoping that people can be able to go ahead and message me their questions on Twitter. We're also streaming live on YouTube at TDF Media Studios. So to all those on YouTube and Twitter, thank you for joining us. You're going to hear things buzzing and beeping, but it's by design. Because ultimately, I want people to be able to have the opportunity to take part in what is happening here in Kyiv and across Ukraine. The first thing I would like to talk about this evening is the situation at the front lines. We've talked about this over and over. The Russians are attempting to break through our defensive lines, and the same result is being seen in every event. They are failing. Once again today, the Armed Forces of Ukraine's defensive lines have held in the directions of Kupiansk, remember that name, along with Marinka, Avdiivka, and Liman, were the sites of more than 36 separate clashes, and those clashes resulted in unsustainable losses by the Russian invaders. We know from the new law that passed in Russia that they are attempting to move their capacity, military capacity, to an active duty number of 1.5 million from the current number of 1.15 million. And yet they're continuously sending their troops to their death against us. On a more positive note, we are advancing in several directions. Specifically, a town we've talked about before, Klishivka and Staromayorsky. Expect to hear a lot more from both of those locations in the very near future. Remember, we don't talk about liberation until it's officially confirmed. But what I can tell you is that you want to pay attention to where those two settlements are located on the maps. Let's move ahead to another military discussion, one that's disgusting, for lack of a better term, and that's Russia's continued escalation of the grain crisis. What they have done is taken a settled situation. Even in the midst of war, the grain deal was a settled situation. Our neighbors in the global south were being fed. Ukrainian farmers were being paid. And the Russians, for once, were not being assholes. Unfortunately, they were not able to contain themselves, and we know what happened. They declared, as of midnight on July 20th, every one of our ships to be potentially carrying military cargo and therefore a target of their Navy, Air Force, and drones. President Zelenskyy did the only thing he could, and he went ahead and did the same for the Russian ships. And as such, what the world is going to learn is that the Ukrainian Navy and the Ukrainian Armed Forces have the ability to guarantee that Russians' navigation of the Black Sea will not only be obstructed, but potentially come to an end. Any Russian ship is now a possibility to join the Moskva. Another thing that we would like to discuss is what happened yesterday evening, where President Zelenskyy was very clear. Nothing comes before victory. And this came in reference to questions over issues at the National Bank of Ukraine, and specifically about the Minister of Culture and Information, who's now the former Minister of Culture and Information. We must understand that when times are difficult, and times are extremely difficult right now for so many across Ukraine and across the world who are supporting us in our battle for liberty and liberation, that ultimately there cannot be any shortcuts, there cannot be any grift, there cannot be any graft. President Zelenskyy was elected in 2019 to make certain that Ukraine was put on a pathway to be able to enter the European community. That pathway, due to the full-scale invasion of the Russian enemy, was sped up by several years. But President Zelenskyy has not lost sight of what's important, and that is to make certain that the full transparency that is expected of every country that becomes a full member of NATO and a full member of the European Union is in line with the values of those two organizations. And so whether it is a minister of culture, whether it is people who are trading weapons, which just came out in the last 24 hours, whether it is people who simply are breaking the law in order to make an extra buck or two while their country people are suffering. Whatever the reason, nothing can get in the way of victory. And that includes an individual's personal gain. Let's now talk about another issue that is going to be of great importance moving forward. You'll see me moving down to my notes because I said this was going to be a different kind of broadcast. The Russians are beginning to mentally enslave members of the temporarily and illegally occupied parts of Ukraine. They are preparing for yet another fraudulent election, an election that will hold no value and no standing, either with the people of the currently occupied territories or the international community. However, they're moving ahead with it. And in doing so, they're withholding medicines. They're withholding the ability of people to return to their homes, with one exception. If Ukrainians are willing to take Russian passports or go Russian citizenship, they are treated halfway decent. But if not, we're seeing Ukrainians become filtrated to the illegally annexed Crimea, as well as Russia itself. Ultimately, on this Friday afternoon, we must remember that the goal still remains the same: complete liberation and a return to the 1991 borders, the implementation of President Zelensky's 10-point peace plan, and justice for those who have been wronged. And that leads me to the next point. Justice came today in the form of the apprehension of convicted murderer and international terrorist, former FSB colonel, and critic of the Putin regime, Igor Girkin, who some of you will know for standing in front of the so-called Donbas People's Republic flag, spouting off nonsense. Also going by the code name of Strelkov, Girkin was responsible for the downing of Malaysian Airways Flight 17. He was also in charge of the militia that stormed Sloviansk and caused so much pain, suffering, and anguish to that city in 2014. However, understand this: there's no good actors within the Russian Federation. So just because Prigozhin turned on Putin doesn't make Prigozhin Robin Hood. And just because Putin apprehended a murderer and terrorist most certainly doesn't absolve Putin of his crimes against humanity. What we are watching, make no mistake about this, is the complete implosion and destruction of the Russian Federation from within. Victory is inevitable. Liberation, undeniable. Liberty and liberation are Ukraine. But there's another fact there. A transformative defeat of Russia is happening before our eyes. And we must grasp this moment and recognize this is our chance to defeat tyranny, to stomp out the evil of the world, and to ensure democracy throughout Europe once and for all. Ultimately, when you have Putin, Prigozhin, Medvedev, Strelkov, and the war criminal propagandists, such as Skabeva, such as Solyakov, and all of the other mill bloggers who decide to do nothing but debase humanity by debasing the memories of our eternal heroes, justice will find them all. And justice doesn't have to come at the end of a rifle. It can, and during war it often does. But understand yet again that no Russian war criminal, no Russian terrorist will escape the justice that they are deserved of. And so ultimately on this Friday night, as so many head into a weekend, on this Friday night, as the Germans and so many other allies have stepped up even more aid to us, the long arm and reach of the law of Ukraine, but most importantly, our partners in the international community, are working to find justice for all those who become victims of Russian terrorism and Russian war criminals. I want to take a moment to recognize more terror victims. All too often, folks who die at the hands of the Russians are nothing more than a statistic, nothing more than a number, nothing more than just a scratch note in somebody's notepad. Last night, at least one more person perished in Odessa, and 2 in Mykolaiv. And multiple others are clinging to life. We cannot grow bored. We cannot grow tired. And we cannot grow blasé over the fact that every day more and more Ukrainian civilians are dying. And these Ukrainian civilians who are dying at the hands of the Russian terrorists are every bit the eternal heroes that my brothers and sisters who have passed away in the armed forces of Ukraine and the defense forces are. There is so much death around us, so much. But with that death comes an honor that the Russians will never have. And it's why we're able to be in position to softly demobilize people, to prepare soldiers who are no longer equipped to fight for civilian life, while the Russians are drafting and mobilizing 70-year-olds. However, it doesn't mean that it becomes easy. This is a hard war. It is a slog. Having been here for over 500 days, I'm a witness to both the difference that has taken place in society and a witness to what's taken place inside of myself. Many of you have watched my journey, and there's been a couple of different phases of it. But one thing's for certain, we're all tired, but we're all as resolute as ever. And that is something that comes back to a very, very important point to make. Russia hates the truth. And the truth that the Russians hate the most is that they believed on February 24th, 2022, that they would engage in a 3-day special operation. And 509 days later, they are in the midst of a war of their own making against the people of Ukraine that will end in the downfall of Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev, of Strelkov and of Prigozhin, and so many others who attempted to live off of deals with the devil. You will see the propaganda getting worse. You will hear of atrocities. There are so many atrocities that are yet to be reported. This is why the United Nations stated in their report 2 days ago but the number of adults who they had marked as being victims of Russian terrorism, which was already in the thousands. This came from the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, was most likely woefully undercounted. As we move forward, as we break the Russian defenses, as we take every meter of Ukrainian soil back, more is uncovered. And yet, the armed forces of Ukraine pushes ahead. Our civilian leadership stays strong. And most importantly, the people of Ukraine continue to support the one value that they cherish above all others, and that's freedom. I know this has been a long broadcast, but I won't apologize. Because ultimately, if you care enough to be watching what's happening in Ukraine, if you care enough to be watching this show, Ukraine in the Know, from the Armed Forces of Ukraine's Territorial Defense Forces Media studios, it means that you have a soul, and it means that you have a heart, and it means that you have the analytical understanding to get, to accept, and to process why this battle is the ultimate battle of the last 80 years. So on that note, with updates to come this evening, I appreciate the time to speak to you. Slava Ukraini. May God bless our troops, our sailors, our pilots, and the families of all the eternal heroes, civilian and otherwise, who have sacrificed everything so we can have the chance to finally defeat evil in this world. Have a good afternoon.